Hi everybody, so I'm going to give you some video feedback for your annotations for Module 6 for this week. So for the Richard Hakluyt source, you all did a great job sort of pulling out the multiple motivations or main reasons that Hakluyt gives for British colonization of the Americas. Religion is one that a lot of you focused in on, or at least this sort of idea that we have some sort of religious mission, or we need to recommit our commitment to God by, extending our reach to the Americas and converting who we find there. Obviously, there's a big economic motivation, trade, competition with Spain, so wanting to really reassert or assert Britain's power over Spain as sort of the European nation with the widest reach, with the most territory, the most resources that they're going to bring back to increase their power at home. And then there's this element of persuasion, which you guys focused in on. So persuading the queen for her support. But then there's also the element of persuading all the folks that are going to go and settle the Americas. So I think this source is really interesting to read in conjunction with Winthrop, because you get sort of the early picture of what British motivations were for going. And then the Puritans and John Winthrop's source really gets into sort of a very specific religious motivation. Although we know that it's intertwined with economics, it's much more on its face. It's very much about religion. So for John Winthrop's City on a Hill source, there was some great annotations in there about really fleshing out how the Puritans saw themselves as this real shining beacon or example of what a perfect or especially godly society could look like for the rest of the world. And, you can sort of think about how much pressure that actually puts the Puritans are putting on themselves, and how that translates into how they are regulating their own behavior. And one of the things that a lot of you picked up on was the interplay between their religious outlook and then the social dynamics at play. So the relationships, for example, between rich and poor in Puritan society, the relations between, who has power and who doesn't. One thing really important to keep in mind with Puritans is that every single thing they think about is seen through the eyes and the lens of their religious beliefs. They do not separate, how their economics function in their towns, outside events like weather, diseases, everything is viewed through the lens of religion. That becomes really important, especially as you see in our discussion of the Salem witch trials. All right. Oh, I hope you all liked the very first Memory Palace podcast you listened to for Module 6. This is one of my very favorite podcasts. So you'll be listening to a few more episodes as we move forward in the semester. So the discussion on this one I thought was really interesting, especially in light of this larger issue of historical memory. So thinking about the ways in which we sort of collectively remember certain events or commemorate certain events year after year, and whose perspective is celebrated, whose perspective is sort of seen as the actual truth of what happened, and whose is maybe not remembered. So this story of Thanksgiving, sort of commemorating the treaty between Massasoit and the Pilgrims, and Charlotte Mitchell's sort of really complicated understanding of her ancestors' relationships with Europeans, and then her own sort of contested relationships with non-native people. It's really interesting to ask those kinds of questions. So this particular podcast and then your annotations of it reminded me of the responses that you all gave for the Slido poll question about which group of English settlers we remember more as more significant, Virginians or New Englanders. I'm thinking about that Thanksgiving story as one of the things that we sort of constantly remind ourselves of in terms of our narrative of English settlement in the Americas year after year. And then one of you, I can't remember who exactly, one of you said that it reminded you of that very first Slido poll I asked you about history being written by the winners. And I think this is a clear example of what happens when it's written by the winners, and sort of how we can maybe poke holes in the winner's story. So great job with all of these annotations. Really enjoyed reading the conversations, and keep it up. I'll see you all next week for more annotations feedback.